Now that we have all of our blocks finished, we can start piecing our quilt top. So in this beginner series, I am working through the ponder pattern. But as I work through all of these steps to putting a quilt together, I'm giving tips along the way that should help you work through any quilt pattern that you may have. So now that I have all the blocks finished to this quilt, it's time to start piecing it together. So of course, I'm going to be giving you tips along the way. The first thing I like to do once I get all of my quilt blocks finished is lay them all out. I like to lay them out in the way I want my quilt to look when it is finished. In this quilt pattern, it's a little bit easier because there is a definite design to it, and all the fabrics and everything have certain places that they go on the pattern. However, many quilt patterns, you'll have blocks that are different colors or different shades, and they might look better in specific areas of the quilt. So lay them all out and make sure you like the design layout that you've come up with. Now, not all of us have a design board, so if you don't have a big display area to lay all the quilt blocks out on, I'll give you a few ideas for what you could do. You could lay them all out on an open floor space area, on top of a table, or even a bed. This might not be the best thing you can do if you are not able to sew the quilt top all together at once, so I'll give you some ideas on how to make that work as well. So my tip number 2 is, once you get the layout you love, take a photo of it. This is so important because it'll help you in later steps, but it'll also help you right away, because inevitably a dog, a child, or you just may need to pack everything up and be done for the day and not be finished. So if a dog or child runs over the quilt pieces that are laying on a floor, or decides to jump on the bed and they get all mixed up, you have a photo to reference back to make sure you get everything back in the order that you would like it to be. So once you have everything laid out and have taken a photo of your quilt, it is time to assess the best way to piece your quilt together. Maybe it's by making larger segments, larger squares, and working in that way, or maybe it's in working in rows or in columns. However you're going to piece the quilt, figure out what the best way is for you. And a lot of times the pattern you are using will let you know a good method for piecing the quilt together, and that's always helpful as well. So for my quilt, I'm going to be piecing it together in rows. So next, I'm going to give you some tips on piecing rows together that might make it a little bit easier for you. So after figuring out the best way for you to piece your quilt blocks together to finish off the entire quilt top, it's time to figure out how you're going to get those pieces from wherever you've laid them out to your sewing machine to sew. So there are a few things you could do. You could take a few blocks at a time, maybe 2 blocks from wherever you have them laid out, over to your sewing machine and sew them together. Maybe that would feel very comfortable for you. What I like to do is to utilize the design boards that I made. So what I do, since I typically like to try to piece my quilts in rows, if that's how the quilt can be pieced, I stack up the rows in order that they'll be sewn together on the design board. And then I place a pin that I made that is numbered. So this is row 1. And then I can pick up the stack of fabric and take it over to the sewing machine and sew it together. I'll also keep the photo of the quilt handy just so I can refer to it and make sure I'm putting the blocks together in order, because I don't want to accidentally somehow turn this block up like this and then it doesn't work out right for row 1 and I'll have to rip out seams. So keeping the photo handy really helps me make sure that I stay organized. Now, another nice thing about using these design boards is that if you have made a few of them or have purchased a few of them, You can free up the space that you have everything laid out on, such as a bed or floor, or even your design board in your home if you like to work on multiple projects at a time and you want to lay out another one. If you have these design boards, you can label the rows and keep everything organized without having to take up that valuable space. So after I get the rows laid out on my design boards, I head over to the sewing machine and start sewing them. I'll usually get my rows all sewn together, and I keep these pins in it to remember which order they go in, and then I start pressing them. So that is what I'll show you next. So my next tip involves pressing your seams. So whether you've brought your quilt together in larger segments or in rows, either way, you're going to need to press seams. So since I've brought my quilt together in rows, I pressed my seams based on those rows. So sometimes your pattern will tell you which way to press the seams in your rows once you brought them together, or you'll just kind of have to rely on yourself if you're doing your own pattern. What I tend to do for rows is press the seams in opposite directions. So for my odd numbered rows, this is my row 1, I pressed all of the seams to the left. So you can see the seams are laying to the left. And then for my even numbered rows, my seams are pressed to the right. This seam was part of a block, so it's pressing the way the pattern told me to. It's just the seams that I brought together to bring all these blocks together that are pressed to the right. So I didn't change the direction of any seams I already pressed. I just focused on the ones that were not pressed once I brought the rows together. Now, the reason I find pressing the seams, again, so important is that these seams can nest together for my next step, which is sewing all the rows together. So if you press them in opposite directions, when you bring those seams together, they'll just lay nicely together and you won't have a lot of bulk there. So that brings me to my next tip for you. So I know that I have those starts of the rows together because of my pins here. So I'm going to turn this and show you what I like to do when I'm bringing all these rows together. So I have all these nicely pressed seams that are going to nest together really well. If I just brought this over to the sewing machine and sewed this long row, the fabric's going to distort, it's going to stretch out. And even though right now the ends are meeting pretty nicely, if I just started sewing across here, my feed dogs would bring this bottom piece of fabric through really nicely, and the pressure from my presser foot is going to stretch out this top layer of fabric. And when I get to the end, it'll probably look more like this, and it won't match up nicely anymore. And all that work I did bringing these blocks together will be wasted. So my tip for you here is to pin and then pin some more and pin some more. It'll keep all of this lovely fabric that you work so hard to piece together nice and even. It'll keep all these seams lining up nicely so that all the work you did really shows in the end. What I like to do when I am pinning a quilt like this is I like to look at what I want to really focus on to meet up nicely. And for this, it is definitely these segments here. If these meet up nicely, that means that this whole design is going to come together. So that is what I pin first. I'll meet these seams up that I nested with all my pressing, and I will put a pin in there and a pin in there. And then I'll go over to my next section here and pin there. And there. So that's not all I want to pin though, because if I start sewing over here, that end meets nicely. But if I sew along and there's a lot of pressure, see how just from my finger it starts bubbling it up there, and then you're going to have some pinched fabric. The pinched fabric isn't the end of the world, because once you quilt and wash it, it's all going to kind of shrink together and you're going to get that lovely crinkly quilt anyway. But, you know, we want it to look really nice right away, right? We don't want to wait until we quilt it and then wash it and get that crinkly feeling. So you'll want to pin everywhere else as well. I'll put a pin at the beginning, pin some more, kind of use my fingers to make sure everything's laying nice and flat. Because see, right now there's not a bubble over there. But we also haven't gone under the sewing machine and had the feed dogs feeding the bottom fabric through nicely and our presser foot pressing along the top. So I just worked through and put a whole bunch of pins in. There's a pinned segment between these two, so I'll just place a few more pins. I like to put it at seams whenever I can, just because it'll hold them in place and my presser foot won't push them in other directions. So those are just some ideas of where you might want to throw a pin. I definitely pin at this part way more than I do anywhere else. You'll often see me not putting any pins when I'm putting blocks together. That's because I can usually trim or do something else to compensate any missed sewing or, you know, things like that. But here, I want to pin. I want all the work I put into putting the blocks together to show. So here, it's meeting nicely at the end. I'm going to put a pin there, then I'll start pinning that between section, because I know this is lined up. All the rest of the pins that I put in between these two segments are just going to be keeping that fabric nice and even. So there's a few options here that you can do after this. You can take this segment over to the sewing machine and sew it and then add on row 3, or if you would like, you can grab your next 2 rows. So I have row 1 and row 2 right now that are pinned together. I have it turned because it's easier for me to pin it facing me. So I have row 1 and row 2. Sometimes I'll go ahead and take the number 2 out because I know I have row 1 and 2. My other rows are still pinned, so this is just an extra pin that might get in my way, poke me, whatever. So you could either go sew this, press it, add on row 3, or you can set that row that you already pinned to the side and grab your row 3 and row 4 and go ahead and get that pinned and ready to go as well. And then I have row 5, 6, and 7 left over. So I could pin row 5 and 6, and I can go ahead and get 3 of these sewn and then just lay them back in order and get some more segments sewn together. So whatever way is easier for you. Maybe it's easier to sew row 1 and 2 together, then add on 3, and then add on 4 and work in that way, or you can work in bunches. However it's easier for you, go ahead and get your quilt top pieced now. All right, my quilt top is all finished. I have it all pieced together and it looks so good. Now, my quilt top isn't quite finished though. If you remember from the cutting segment of this series, I do have some border pieces here that need to get added on to this quilt. So in the next video, I'll be giving you some tips on adding borders to your quilt. So I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Bye.